Welcome back to Careers at the End of the World. It's me, Jenn, your host. And today I want to talk about something that comes up in almost every single workshop and webinar that I give, which is how to tell if you're qualified for a job and if it matters if you're qualified for a job or not. The last time I gave my workshop, How to Job Search at the End of the World, which, by the way, if you haven't seen it, you can go to workwonderscareers.com and sign up for our mailing list, and you can get a copy of an on-demand version of that workshop that I have available for folks. And I partner with a lot of different organizations on a fairly regular basis to give this workshop. I've given it to tech ladies. I've hosted my own versions. I've done it with Creative Mornings. And it gives a little snapshot, right, of like our approach to job searching, and in particular, our approach to job searching when times are freaking tough. And one of the very good questions that comes up when I talk about our resume strategy is about qualifications. So this is kind of an episode I'm surprised I haven't. So let me talk to you a little bit about qualifications, right, and requirements on a job posting and why I think they're important. You can go back and listen to our episode on resumes. I'll link to it in the show notes. But qualifications are important. And I think the reason qualifications are important is because if I go all the way back to the beginning of my journey in hiring, one of the very first things that I did was have to sort applicants, and I'd have to sort them into qualified applicants and unqualified applicants. And the reason for that is because we were really only supposed to consider qualified applicants for the job. So if people applied and didn't meet our requirements, they weren't supposed to be someone who would be considered. And I don't think a lot of people realize this, but that is sort of one of the ways in which our equal opportunity practice or policy was operationalized. The reason, and I'm not saying this is the best way to do this, but the reason we want to consider qualified applicants is because the boss's neighbor's niece could be in the applicant pool. And to prevent her getting a leg up because she knows the boss, we'd want to make sure, right? You'd want to give every qualified person an equal chance. We want to make sure that she meets the qualifications of the role in order to be considered, and not just know the boss, for example, to be considered. And so as I started my own practice and started working with job seekers, I really have emphasized over the years how important those qualifications are, because that's what people like me, the recruiters, the people on the front end of the process, that's what they're looking for to move you to the hiring manager. They want to make sure that you're qualified to be considered for the role. And I have found that job seekers specifically, will respond to the responsibilities section. Yes, I can do that. Yes, I can do that. Or I'd be willing to do that. And I do think the responsibilities section of a job posting is in fact important to help you ascertain if you want the job or not. But the qualifications section is important when it comes to your resume, because the question your resume needs to answer is, are you qualified for this job? Not are you qualified for a job? Are you qualified for this job? So we need to look at those qualifications. Sometimes they're listed as requirements. Sometimes they're branded and say something like you are, or they have some other language. But it's basically a set of skills and experiences you need to be considered to do the responsibilities. And so the point of the resume is really to speak to those and to demonstrate those so that the stakeholders early on in the process can put you in the right pile. It can move you to the yes pile, even if it's a digital pile. And so our resume strategy, right, involves a summary of qualifications, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's not a personal summary. It's not about you. It's about you in relation to the job that you're applying for and what the qualifications are for that role. That's a really important strategy. It continues to be a very effective strategy for us. And it's not something everyone does. It's not even something everyone thinks is important, which is okay. I can live with that. Partly what it does is it encourages our clients to make sure that they're applying for jobs where they're well qualified. Okay. And that, I think, is part of the reason, and I say this in our resume episode, that our clients are successful, because they're not applying all over the place anymore. They're applying for jobs where there's alignment between their experience and skill set and the qualifications for the jobs they want. That makes a huge difference on your overall job search, okay? especially right now in a tight job market. There's not a lot of wiggle room. You might be thinking, okay, well, I check half these boxes, but I can guarantee you in many cases with large applicant pools, there's going to be people who check all the boxes. And you want to think about that for yourself, right? Who am I competing against and what do they look like? And is this a good use of my time? Now, the last time I gave this webinar, I got a very, very good question, which is, do we really have to be qualified? Because we know that women and marginalized professionals are less likely to identify as qualified. And how do we make sense of that using your suggestion? And it's such a good question because that is also true. People with marginalized identities will undersell in the workplace. You can call it imposter syndrome. I think it's actually just it's part of what oppression does in the workplace is it makes you undersell yourself. It makes you not value yourself. I want to share with you the difference here because it doesn't actually change my mind on whether or not you should apply for jobs you're largely qualified for. You, in fact, should. But to her point, what happens when the vast majority of working people think they're underqualified for the job that they want? I tell a couple of stories in my webinar. One is I had this really lovely client probably 5 or 6 years ago, and she was looking for a real significant career change, a real big pivot. And she brought me this job one day and she was like, I love this job. It resonates so much. There's so much going on here. I check all these boxes except for like this one. And that one was a master's degree. And I remember very clearly it was a master's degree in either communications or science, like a master's degree in biology or something. And what this client had was a medical degree. She was an MD. She'd worked for years as a literal physician. I want you to hear that. She was like, I'm not really sure, my experience is quite right. And I said to her, correct. It's not quite right. It is not a master's degree in biology, but we're going to assume that it is sufficient or better. Okay. You check all these other boxes perfectly. We're going to go ahead and have you apply for this job because you're so excited about it. And we're not going to worry about this one piece of experience. You have a graduate degree. You have science training. I would argue you also have communications training. So let's go ahead and apply. And that is a good example of someone who was ready to undersell themselves. Okay. That person was practically perfectly qualified for the job and just didn't have exactly the right graduate degree, but did in fact have a graduate degree, did in fact have graduate training in the sciences. And I said, we're going to treat that like that's okay. We're going to treat that like it's sufficient. This person also had, postdoc experience in research. So I wasn't really worried about that. And that is actually the job she ended up getting and accepting and loving. So I'm sharing that because I want to share how I think this manifests for people, where people, the people that question was about, right? Like women and other marginalized folks at work, we tend to undervalue our experience. Like if it's not an exact perfect match. The first thing we want to look at are the qualifications, yes. But that's a somewhat dangerous thing to do if you're not in a good position to give yourself credit for your freaking work experience. I will see clients, the qualifications will just say something like familiarity or experience with quantitative and qualitative data, right? And everyone's always familiar enough with qualitative data, but there's something about that quantitative piece that really is a trigger for a lot of people that I work with. Because what do they mean by that? I mean, do they mean you can do some basic Excel and largely understand data? Do they mean you're basically a statistician? People's minds will jump to a PhD level data analyst before they'll really just understand to contextualize that. Well, if they're asking for qualitative and quantitative data, let's look at the job description. Does it say anything in the responsibilities section about running complex data sets and being able to be the go-to, quantitative data analyst on the team? Or do they just want to know that you can make basic sense out of numbers? You have some basic analysis here. You can use context clues to figure that out. But I find that especially around data, quantitative, anything technical, all of a sudden clients' minds go to, well, what do they mean by that? It could be anything, and it could be anything. But the rest of that job description is giving us a lot of context, okay? So we need to go back and see, like, is there any other reference to quantitative data in this job posting? Is there any reference to analysis or stats or anything else indicating that this is a, highly analytical role? Generally, there's not. I mean, unless I'm working with someone who isn't highly analytical, people don't actually ask themselves this question. It's more like people who are using analysis in some aspect of their work, who are expected to be able to kind of generate insights at a higher level. Oftentimes, you can figure out even through the hiring process, like how deep is your bench on the data analysis side? Sometimes there's an entire team that does that work and just provides you, a summarized version. So these are where I see people really underselling themselves, over assuming, I don't know if that's a phrase, but they're assuming in a list of things, they're adding too much to the qualifications. We don't want to add things to the qualifications. We want to just look at them in the context of the role and assess if we have that experience. If you are pivoting, okay, then you might need to really think about unpacking and repositioning your experience in order to see your qualifications. This is really not a super easy or simple thing to walk through in a podcast episode. So if you are looking to do this, I'm going to suggest you get some support from a professional who can help you, because it is a little bit of a process. The longer you've been in a job or a field, the more you want to pivot into something completely different. That's some work. There's some work involved in that. But often when people go through that process, they're able to really get a lot of value out of the experience they do have. One of my favorite things to do is just remove all industry references from prior work experience. If it's not helpful and it's not something that we're leveraging, you can totally do that. You don't need to be direct and super clear about all of the industry specific references. You can be much more generic and high level in our language. And that is often something that makes people's experience, it's more flexible, right? When it's less specific in some cases, if you're making a pivot of some kind. So that is another way that we help people sort of get at this question of, are you qualified? Because it's not always a simple question to answer, and there's many factors that can make it complex. The other piece of it is that you don't have to just apply for jobs that you're perfectly qualified for. I don't ever tell people not to apply for jobs. What I do tell people is, if you want a job quickly, we don't want to apply for 100% of jobs that look like this one. Do you see the difference? So I think it's important when someone whose job is to help people apply for jobs, I don't want to say no. If someone's motivated to apply for a job, you better believe I want to maximize and capitalize on that person's energy and momentum and enthusiasm. I don't get those moments very often in this line of work. I'm going to take them where I can get them. But do I want my clients applying primarily for jobs where they are not meeting the qualifications? No, I generally don't. Are there exceptions? Sure, but that's what they are. They're exceptions. The vast majority of our clients are extremely well qualified for the jobs that they're applying for. Let me add one more layer for you to think about here. In my client's mind, as they're hearing me say very similar things as you're hearing right now, sometimes they will be like, okay, am I qualified for this job, or is this job completely aspirational? Is it totally out of reach? And instead of using that language, I'm going to share with you the language that I actually use. I will say, you're extremely well qualified for this job. You're extremely underqualified for this job, or you're a little underqualified for this job. I also sometimes will use the language of, this is like a reach job. You remember when you were applying to colleges and you knew you wanted to go to college in the fall, you apply for some colleges where you're like, yes, I'm a very good fit here. And then this is a little bit more of a reach. It's kind of a very similar principle. You're maximizing your potential here. And so I really prefer that language of, it's a reach. I'm a little underqualified, because that is about your fit for the role and not about your capacity as a worker or a contributor. It doesn't reflect poorly on your experience. People will often just be like, I'm not good enough for this role. Like, that's not really what it is. 3 years from now, you might be. One role from now, you might be a really great candidate. You're a little underqualified. This is a reach role. We're not quite checking all the boxes. And, if you're excited, go for it. I always say, look, stranger things have happened than underqualified and unqualified people getting roles. I'm not going to point fingers, but I think there's some very highly visible examples of that, of people at work who absolutely don't have the merit, the qualifications, the experience, the temperament, the values to be in the role they are in now. But more often than not, the people who get into these roles are well qualified, okay? And if they're not well qualified, they're well connected. And if you are not well connected, I recommend being well qualified. And in an ideal world, we're both well qualified and well connected, okay? But we can often only kind of manage one of those at a time, and that's okay. So should you focus on jobs that you're largely well qualified for? Yes. This is a tough market right now. There are lots of people looking for jobs, and there's lots of people between jobs who are applying to jobs consistently at a high volume. The competition in most spaces is intense, okay? There's a lot of applicants across the board. If you are consistently applying for jobs where you are unqualified or underqualified, you are not setting yourself up to be a standout candidate. And when you're consistently underqualified and unqualified, there's almost no way for your resume to be a great resume. It's not to say there can't be compelling aspects to you as a person or a candidate. It's just that a resume is good to the degree that it demonstrates your qualifications. I can't make anyone a good resume for any job. I can make well-qualified people a superb resume for their target jobs. I can make underqualified people who are making a pivot or looking for a change a really strong resume, right? And that's sufficient in many cases. But I'm not over here, turning accountants into product managers overnight. That's not an easy thing to do. We're having to take baby steps. We're making transitions that are iterative, in the right direction, small changes over time, and that helps you build up those qualifications for different kinds of roles. But I also want people to pay attention to the ways in which they undersell their experience. They add on qualifications or depth to those qualifications that aren't there, because that will not be helpful to you. It helps me to be very black and white. Do you have this experience or do you not have this experience? If you don't have this experience, what similar experience do you have? If you are making a pivot, if you are aiming for some kind of growth opportunity, please sit with these questions. Do not just take the first, oh no, I've got nothing. Sit with your experience, unpack your experience. Like I use this analogy of it's an excavation and we're taking off one level of soil at a time here. Sometimes we really need to do that for people who are making a change of some kind, because you probably have a lot more work than you're giving yourself credit for. If you are a more passive job seeker, then I think it's fine. It's more fine for someone like you to shoot your shot, right? By all means. I'm not going to stop anyone from shooting your shot, okay? But what we don't want is a job search full of Hail Marys for people who are urgently job seeking. So I want that to be the message, is like, a Hail Mary is a Hail Mary because you do it once in a while. That's not how you play that sport, right? Like that's not the move that they're looking to make several times in a game. There's better strategies. There's like more routine, predictable ways to get to success. And that's largely the plan that makes sense for most of the people that we work with. So I'm hoping this gives you some food for thought on how you can better understand and respond to things like job qualifications. I often find that this work is, especially if you haven't approached it like this before, it's front loaded. It is a lot of work up front, but I always like to remind people, like, this is going to pay off because you're going to learn how to distill and curate your narrative, not just in your resume, which is good, but you're going to learn how to do it in your interviews when you're talking about your stories and you want to share relevant information and leave out less relevant information. It's also going to help you when you're networking and you're talking about yourself. You don't need the whole 20 years of work experience you have. You need to focus on what the qualifications are, right, for the kinds of jobs that you want, and spend time and energy kind of cultivating a narrative around those things rather than the totality of your experience. So doing this work up front will absolutely pay off. Will help you have a more effective and efficient job search throughout the rest of your process. I hope this gives a little bit of insight into why qualifications are important, why you should in fact be well qualified for a job, and how to be more well qualified for a job or think about yourself. I really do sometimes have to gently nudge people into acknowledging their qualifications. I don't know if you're one of those people. If you are, consider this your gentle nudge, okay? And if you need help really thinking about your qualifications and experience and positioning them in an optimal way, please reach out. That's what we do over here. It's not uncommon that people struggle to do this on their own. They do work with career coaches and resume writers. So come on over to workwonderscareers.com. Let us know how we can help you. We do something really fun during Mercury retrogrades, because, we love astrology over here. And during Mercury retrogrades, we do a little sale on our resume writing services. So come on over. We've got a Mercury retrograde coming up soon. I can't remember exactly when it starts, but I'll add it in the show notes. And you can book in, get a little deal, and let us do some of the hard work of really repositioning some of your experience and your content on your resume. In the meantime, feel free to say hello over on Instagram. I'm at Work Wonders Careers. And I'd love to hear if this answered your questions about qualifications and whether or not they're important and how to tell people that you have them. Okay, we'll talk to you soon. Have a great rest of your week.